The rusty elevator wheezed and groaned as it carried 84-year-old Isabella Martinez up to the 5th floor of the Riverside Tenement, a building that had seen better days sometime in the distant past. Her son Roberto had just done the unthinkable, abandoning his own mother in one of the city's most run-down apartment buildings, with nothing but 2 grocery bags of belongings and a month's rent paid in advance. "This is temporary, Mom," Roberto had lied smoothly as he practically pushed her out of his Mercedes. "Just until I can find you something better. The neighborhood is improving." But Isabella wasn't born yesterday. She could see the shame in his eyes, the way he kept checking his expensive watch, eager to escape before any of his country club friends might see him in this part of town. The truth was as clear as the water stains on the tenement walls. Roberto's new wife, a social media influencer 25 years his junior, had made it crystal clear that having an elderly mother-in-law around was bad for her carefully curated lifestyle brand. Isabella had become an embarrassment to be hidden away. For 62 years, Isabella had poured her life into making Roberto successful. She had worked double shifts at the textile factory, her fingers bleeding from handling rough fabrics, all to pay for his private school education. She had sold her late husband's tools, her mother's china, even her wedding ring to fund Roberto's business degree, and the startup capital for his first company. When Roberto was building his construction empire, Isabella had been his unpaid bookkeeper, working late into the night to balance accounts and track expenses. She had been his emotional support during his divorce from his first wife, his babysitter for his children, his cook for business dinners when he needed to impress clients. And now, at 84, when Isabella needed support and care, Roberto had disposed of her like outdated equipment, storing her away in this crumbling building where she could no longer interfere with his image of success. The apartment Roberto had rented for her was a studio on the building's top floor, reached by stairs when the elevator inevitably broke down. The single room contained a Murphy bed that looked like it hadn't been used in years, a kitchenette with appliances from the 1970s, and a bathroom with plumbing that groaned ominously every time the water ran. The windows were cracked, letting in both cold air and the constant noise from the street below. The walls were thin enough that Isabella could hear every conversation, argument, and crying baby in the adjacent apartments. This was clearly the cheapest accommodation Roberto could find, a place to warehouse his inconvenient mother while maintaining plausible deniability about his care for her. Isabella sat on the sagging mattress and allowed herself one moment of complete despair. At 84 years old, after a lifetime of sacrifice and service, she had been thrown away by the person she loved most in the world. The injustice of it burned in her chest like acid. But Isabella Martinez had not survived 8 decades of life by giving up when things got difficult. She had lived through wars, economic depressions, personal tragedies, and countless challenges that would have broken weaker people. If Roberto thought this place would be her tomb, he was about to learn how wrong he could be. The first night in the tenement was a symphony of urban decay. Sirens wailed in the distance, neighbors shouted through thin walls, pipes clanged and gurgled, and somewhere a baby cried incessantly. But underneath all the chaos, Isabella heard something else. The sound of people fighting to survive, to maintain dignity in impossible circumstances. The next morning, Isabella ventured out to explore her new environment. What she found was not the hopeless slum Roberto probably imagined, but a community of resilient people who had learned to create beauty and meaning despite their surroundings. She met Rosa, a single mother of 4 who had turned the building's basement laundry room into an informal daycare center where working parents could leave their children safely. She encountered Mr. Chen, an elderly Chinese man who maintained a small garden on the building's fire escape, growing vegetables that he shared with anyone who needed fresh food. She discovered that the building's superintendent, Miguel, was actually an unemployed engineer who kept the ancient heating and plumbing systems running through ingenuity and determination, never asking for payment from tenants who couldn't afford it. These people had every reason to be bitter, to surrender to their circumstances, to let the building's decay match their spirits. Instead, Isabella found a community that looked out for each other, shared resources, and refused to let their environment define their worth. "You are new here, Senora," Rosa said on Isabella's third day, offering her a cup of coffee in the makeshift daycare center. "Where are your people?" Isabella briefly explained her situation, careful not to reveal too much about Roberto's wealth or her own former circumstances. She simply said her son had decided she would be more comfortable living independently. Rosa nodded with understanding that came from experience. "Ah, yes. I know this story. When people become inconvenient, they get moved aside. But you know what I learned? Sometimes the place they put us to get rid of us becomes the place where we discover who we really are." Those words resonated deep in Isabella's soul. For 60 years, she had defined herself through her relationship with Roberto. She was his mother, his supporter, his behind-the-scenes help. But who was Isabella Martinez when stripped of that identity? What could she contribute when she had only herself to rely on? The answer began to emerge when Isabella observed the daily struggles of her fellow tenants. The building was falling apart, and many of the residents lacked the skills or resources to address even basic maintenance issues. Faucets leaked continuously. Electrical outlets sparked dangerously. Windows stuck shut or wouldn't close properly. Isabella had learned these skills out of necessity during her early married years when money was too tight to hire professionals. Her late husband had taught her basic plumbing and electrical work, and decades of maintaining their own home had made her surprisingly handy with tools. When she heard Mrs. Garcia crying about a sink that had been leaking for months, Isabella knocked on her door with a small toolbox she had assembled from discarded items found around the building. "Excuse me, Senora, but I couldn't help hearing about your plumbing problem. Would you mind if I took a look?" Mrs. Garcia was skeptical that an 84-year-old woman could fix anything, but desperation made her willing to try. Isabella spent 30 minutes under the sink, her arthritic hands working carefully with worn tools, and emerged with the leak completely stopped. "Senora Isabella, how did you learn to do this?" Mrs. Garcia asked, staring in amazement at her functioning sink. "When you are poor, you learn to fix things yourself or you do without," Isabella replied simply. "My husband taught me that anything mechanical can be understood if you take the time to study how it works." Word spread quickly through the tenement building. By the end of the week, Isabella had fixed 3 more leaks, repaired 2 electrical problems, and helped Mr. Chen expand his fire escape garden with a proper irrigation system she devised from plastic bottles and rubber tubing. Isabella discovered that her practical skills were just the beginning of what she could offer. Many of the tenants were immigrants struggling with English, young mothers overwhelmed by child-rearing challenges, or elderly residents who felt forgotten by the world outside their building. Isabella became an unofficial grandmother to dozens of children whose parents worked multiple jobs. She helped teenage students with homework, drawing on the education she had sacrificed her own opportunities to provide for Roberto. She mediated disputes between neighbors, using wisdom gained from decades of navigating complex relationships. Most importantly, Isabella began to organize the building's residents into a community that could advocate for itself. She called meetings in the basement laundry room, encouraging tenants to share their concerns and work together on solutions. "We may not have money," she told the gathered residents, "but we have skills, experience, and each other. Those are more powerful than people realize." Under Isabella's leadership, the tenants formed committees to address different building needs. Rosa organized childcare sharing so parents could attend night school or work additional shifts. Mr. Chen expanded his gardening project to include multiple families, teaching urban farming techniques that reduced grocery bills. Miguel, the superintendent, worked with a group of younger tenants to tackle major repairs that the landlord had been ignoring for years. Isabella coordinated their efforts, ensuring that safety issues were prioritized and that improvements were made systematically rather than haphazardly. Within 3 months, the Riverside tenement had been transformed from a place of despair into a functioning community. The hallways were clean, the lighting worked properly, and the building buzzed with positive activity. Children played safely in the basement space Rosa had created, while adults attended English classes that Isabella organized in the evenings. Isabella found herself at the center of this transformation, not as a figurehead, but as someone whose experience and wisdom had catalyzed change that was already waiting to happen. She had discovered that at 84 years old, she was not too old to make a difference. She was not too old to lead. She was not too old to matter. The changes in the building began to attract attention from outside. Social workers who had written off the Riverside tenement as a hopeless case started noticing that families were stabilizing, children were attending school regularly, and requests for emergency services had dropped dramatically. A local news reporter investigating stories about urban renewal visited the building and was amazed by what she found. Instead of the typical narrative of decay and despair, she discovered a thriving community that had lifted itself up through collective action and shared purpose. How did this transformation happen? The reporter asked Isabella during an interview in the now flourishing basement community center. It didn't happen, Isabella replied thoughtfully. It was already here. All these people needed was someone to believe in what they could accomplish together. Sometimes, the most important thing you can do is simply show up and pay attention. The news story about the Riverside tenement ran on the evening news and was picked up by other media outlets. Isabella found herself somewhat reluctantly in the spotlight as the face of community organizing and elderly empowerment. But, more importantly, the publicity brought resources and support to the building. A local foundation offered grants for further improvements. A community college partnered with Isabella to provide formal education programs. The city housing authority, embarrassed by the attention, finally forced the landlord to make long overdue structural repairs. Isabella channeled all this attention and support into sustainable improvements that would benefit the community long after media interest moved on. She established a tenant council with rotating leadership, ensuring that the building's self-advocacy would continue regardless of any single person's involvement. She created partnerships with local businesses that provided job training and employment opportunities for tenants. She worked with social service agencies to bring healthcare, legal aid, and financial counseling directly into the building. Most remarkably, Isabella documented everything. She kept detailed records of what had worked, what hadn't, and why. She created a manual for community organizing that other housing complexes began requesting copies of. At 84 years old, Isabella had accidentally become an expert in grassroots community development, and her methods were being studied and replicated across the city. 6 months after Roberto had dumped her in the tenement, Isabella received a visit that would test everything she had learned about herself and her worth. A black Escalade pulled up outside the Riverside tenement, looking as out of place as a spaceship in the neighborhood. Roberto emerged wearing his most expensive suit, clearly making a statement about his success and status. He navigated the now clean building entrance with obvious discomfort, his designer shoes clicking on floors that Isabella and her neighbors had scrubbed and polished. When he reached Isabella's apartment, he found a door marked with a small plaque reading Community Coordinator, and the sound of multiple voices engaged in what was clearly a business meeting. Isabella opened the door before Roberto could knock, having been alerted by the building's informal communication network that an expensive car had arrived. She was not the same woman he had abandoned 6 months earlier. She wore a simple but well-maintained dress. Her hair was styled, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew her worth was not dependent on anyone else's opinion. Behind her, Roberto could see a room transformed into an efficient office space, with charts on the walls tracking building improvements and a desk covered with paperwork that suggested serious organizational work. "Hello, Roberto," Isabella said calmly, stepping into the hallway and closing the door behind her. "What brings you to my neighborhood?" Roberto looked around nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the sounds and smells of the tenement building, even in its improved state. "Mom, I came to check on you. I heard you were involved in some kind of activities here." Isabella smiled, but it was not the warm, submissive smile Roberto remembered from his childhood. This was the smile of someone who had found her power and was not afraid to use it. "Activities?" she repeated. "I suppose you could call community organizing and tenant advocacy activities. What did you think I was going to do here, Roberto? Sit in a corner and wait to die?" Roberto flinched at the directness of her words. "Mom, please, I know you are upset about the living arrangements, but I did what I thought was best. You said you wanted independence." "I said no such thing," Isabella interrupted. "You cited I was an embarrassment to your new lifestyle, and you warehoused me in the cheapest place you could find. But I should thank you, really. This place has taught me things about myself I never would have learned in your guest bedroom." Roberto could not meet her eyes. Behind him he could hear the sounds of children playing safely, adults engaged in productive conversations, and the general hum of a community that was thriving. None of this matched the image he had in his mind of what his mother's life would be like here. What exactly are you doing here?" he asked, confusion evident in his voice. "I am doing what I have always done," Isabella replied. "I am solving problems, organizing resources, and helping people build better lives. The difference is that now I am doing it for people who appreciate my efforts, instead of taking them for granted." For the first time, Roberto really looked at his mother. She appeared healthier than she had in years, more energetic, more engaged with the world around her. She spoke with an authority he had never heard from her before, and she seemed to command respect from everyone who passed by in the hallway. "But Mom, this place? It's not safe for someone your age. You should be somewhere more comfortable." Isabella laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "Safe? Roberto, the only danger I faced was dying of irrelevance in your spare room. Here, I have purpose. I have a community that values my contributions. I have work that matters." She gestured toward the busy hallway around them. "Every person in this building is safer, healthier, and more hopeful because of work we have done together. Can you say the same about anything in your life?" Roberto tried a different approach. "Mom, I know I made mistakes, but we are family. I want to make things right. I found you a nice apartment in a better neighborhood." "Let me stop you there," Isabella said firmly. "The time for you to make things right was 6 months ago, when you had a choice between your mother's well-being and your wife's social media image. You made your choice and I made mine." She paused, watching him process her words. "I chose to build something meaningful with people who value what I bring to their lives. You chose to hide me away so I wouldn't embarrass your brand. Those choices have consequences." Roberto attempted one final manipulation. "But Mom, you are my mother. That has to count for something. I can take care of you properly now." Isabella looked at him with something that might have been pity. "Roberto, you have never taken care of me. I took care of you for 60 years. And the moment you no longer needed me, you threw me away. But you did me a favor." She gestured toward her apartment door, behind which the sounds of productive work continued. "You gave me the chance to discover that I am much more than just your mother. I am a community leader, an organizer, a problem solver, and a person of value in my own right." Isabella stepped closer to her son, close enough that he could see the steel in her aged eyes. "I want to thank you, Roberto. If you hadn't abandoned me here, I never would have learned that my worth is not dependent on your approval or anyone else's. I never would have discovered that at 84 years old I still have important work to do in this world." She turned to go back into her apartment, then paused. "You can keep your comfortable apartment and your social media wife and your country club lifestyle. I have something better, a community that needs me and work that matters." The door closed with quiet finality, leaving Roberto standing alone in the hallway of a building that had been transformed by the woman he had thought was worthless. As he made his way back to his expensive car, he could hear the sounds of children learning, adults planning improvements, and elderly voices sharing wisdom. Roberto had intended to warehouse his inconvenient mother in this place, but instead, he had given her the greatest gift of her life, the opportunity to discover her true worth and to make a difference in the world on her own terms. Isabella watched from her window as the black Escalade pulled away. She felt no satisfaction in Roberto's obvious discomfort, no joy in his realization of what he had lost. But she felt something more valuable: the absolute certainty that she had found her true home and her real family. She turned back to her work, where Rosa was helping new tenants navigate the building support systems, where Mr. Chen was teaching children about growing food in small spaces, where Miguel was training younger residents in building maintenance skills. This was her legacy now. Not the ungrateful son she had raised, but the community she had helped to flourish. At 84 years old, Isabella had learned that it is never too late to discover your purpose, and sometimes the places people put you to get rid of you become the places where you finally find yourself.